Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of this, the Simply Christian podcast, a place where we can just slow down, jump into the life-giving waters of the scriptures, asking questions of the text, maybe not having all the answers yet, but walking this journey together, step by step, as co-learners, explorers, adventurers, seeking out the one that's at the centre of all things, Jesus. So, today we are looking at Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, which says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." So, who were the Nephilim? Giants? Fallen angels? Legendary warriors? And why does this strange little passage appear right before one of the most important events in the entire Bible? There are few passages in Scripture that generate more fascination than Genesis 6. For some, it is one of the Bible's greatest mysteries. For others, it is evidence of supernatural beings interacting with humanity. For others still, it is simply a picture of human corruption and violence. Books have been written about it. Movies have drawn inspiration from it. Entire theories have been built upon 4 short verses. And yet, the irony is that Genesis itself seems far less interested in satisfying our curiosity than we are. The Nephilim are mentioned almost in passing. 4 verses, and then the story moves on. The flood is coming. Judgment is coming. The world is collapsing under the weight of human evil. And that is really where we need to begin, because before we ask who were the Nephilim, we need to ask a bigger question. What is Genesis trying to tell us? So, to recap the story so far, the opening chapters of Genesis tell us a story of creation and then uncreation. Genesis 1 begins with God bringing order out of chaos, light from darkness, land from sea, life from barrenness. Human beings are created in God's image, and the world is declared very good. Everything is functioning as God intended. Humanity walks with God. The creation flourishes. There is harmony, peace, shalom. Then Genesis 3 arrives. Adam and Eve rebel. The serpent deceives and sin enters the world. And immediately things begin to unravel. The relationship between God and humanity fractures. The relationship between husband and wife fractures. The relationship between humanity and creation fractures. Death now enters the story. Then in Genesis 4, east of Eden, Cain murders Abel. The first family becomes the first crime scene. Human sin is no longer merely rebellion against God. It becomes violence against one another. Cain's descendants build cities, forge weapons, and celebrate vengeance. Lamech boasts, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. That's Genesis 4:23-24. We see violence is growing. Humanity is spiraling downward. Yet, alongside Cain's line stands another line. The descendants of Seth, the appointed one. Genesis 4 ends with the words, at that time people began to call on the name of the Lord. Hope remains, faith remains, the image of God remains. Genesis 6 opens with humanity still fulfilling the command from Genesis 1 of being fruitful and multiplying. Humans are spreading throughout the land and daughters are being born to them. So far in the story, we have only mentioned sons, but daughters were also born, and the sons of God saw that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they wanted, which is interesting and perplexing at the same time. But this whole idea of the sons of God and the daughters of men, I think, has 3 views. Firstly, that the sons of God refer to spiritual beings, which was the dominant view among the Jewish religious leaders prior to the Christian era. However, it would appear that there are no accounts in the ancient Near East records of spiritual beings marrying human women. So it's pretty hard to conclude that this is some type of ancient mythology. But the passage implies that they literally took women for themselves. However, that does not necessitate marriage per se. Then secondly, there is a view that the sons of God refers to human rulers, and this became very popular among both Christian and Jewish interpreters in the centuries after Jesus. They thought, being that they use their power to take these women for themselves. And lastly, the view is that these sons of God refers to those who called upon the name of the Lord back at the end of chapter 4, and that they are godly people. Either way, it's not entirely clear. It is true that there are different thoughts about these verses, but for me, the key thing is that it gives flow to the text inasmuch that it further portrays the decay and depravity of the human race. Just look at verse 3. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Something terrible has happened. The corruption and depravity has become universal. The distinction between righteousness and wickedness is collapsing. The earth is filling with violence. And then, right at this moment, we encounter one of the strangest passages in Scripture. Enter the Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Now, it's no explanation, no detailed background. There's no lengthy discussion. Just that. Just a brief description. And then the narrative moves immediately to God's judgment upon a corrupt world, which leaves us asking, Who were the Nephilim? Who were the sons of God? And what exactly happened? Nobody really knows the meaning of the Hebrew word Nephilim. Many scholars connect it to the Hebrew word nephal, meaning to fall. And that has led to translations such as the fallen ones. Others argue the connection is uncertain because the word may simply refer to powerful warriors or mighty men. The difficulty is that the Bible only uses the term twice. Once here in Genesis 6 and once in Numbers 13, and that makes interpretation difficult. There is simply not enough data to be dogmatic about this. But it's never stopped people trying. One view is fallen angels. This is probably the oldest interpretation. In fact, it was the dominant Jewish interpretation before the time of Christ. According to this view, the sons of God were angelic beings. The daughters of men were human women. The Nephilim were the offspring of this union. Why do people think this? Well, because elsewhere in the Old Testament, the phrase sons of God often refers to heavenly beings. For example, in Job 1:6, we read, "One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord." And again in Job 2:1, and again in Job 38:7. In each case, the phrase refers to heavenly beings gathered before God, and some supporters argue that Genesis 6 should be understood in the same way. This interpretation was expanded greatly in the ancient Jewish work known as the Book of Enoch. Now, the Book of Enoch, also known as 1 Enoch, is an ancient Jewish apocalyptic text attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah. It contains unique material on the origins of demons and the Nephilim, the reasons for the fall of some angels, and a prophetic vision of the Messiah's reign. It was written between the 3rd century before the Common Era and the 1st century in the Common Era. It was influential in early Jewish and Christian thought. Although I must point out that the book is not included in the canon of Scripture. It is not in the Bible, but it can be significant for its insights into the beliefs and traditions of ancient Judaism. The book describes angels called watchers descending to earth. They take human wives. Their offspring become giants. Violence fills the world. Corruption spreads. Judgment follows. It all sounds familiar, doesn't it? But as I have said, and must impress upon us, the Book of Enoch is not Scripture. But it may be important because it shows how many Jews understood Genesis before the time of Jesus. In fact, the New Testament appears aware of these traditions. Consider Jude 6 says this, "And the angels who did not keep their position of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness." And then there's 2 Peter 2 verse 4. "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell." Both passages appear in context discussing Noah and the flood. Many scholars believe they echo the Genesis 6 tradition. If this interpretation is correct, then Genesis 6 describes a profound violation of God's created order, a boundary between heaven and earth that has been crossed, creation itself becoming distorted. The world is descending into chaos. But the problem with the angel view is that there is one major challenge. Jesus says in Matthew 22:30, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Many Christians have understood this to mean angels do not reproduce. And if that's the case, Genesis 6 cannot refer to angels. Supporters of the angelic interpretation respond by pointing out that Jesus speaks specifically about angels in heaven, not rebellious angels acting outside of God's design. And so the debate continues. The second view is the Sethite interpretation. Now, this became a dominant interpretation throughout much of church history, particularly through influential theologians such as Augustine of Hippo, one of the early church fathers. According to this view, the sons of God are the descendants of Seth, the godly line. The women are descendants of Cain, the ungodly line. Of course they are. The issue is not angelic human relationships. The issue is the collapse of spiritual distinction. The covenant people are marrying into a culture of rebellion. The line of faith is becoming absorbed into the line of unbelief. Many Christians find this interpretation compelling because it fits the immediate context. Genesis 4 traces Cain's family. Genesis 5 traces Seth's family. Genesis 6 describes the merging of the two. And the result? A society where evil becomes normal. Faith disappears and violence flourishes. The earth becomes corrupt. This certainly matches the broader message of Genesis, but the problem is linguistic. The phrase sons of God rarely refers to ordinary human beings in the Old Testament, which is why many scholars today remain unconvinced by the Sethite view. And then there's the tyrants and kings view, an interpretation that has gained attention among modern scholars. Ancient kings often claimed divine status. Some even called themselves sons of God. Examples would be of rulers in Egypt, and of course even Roman Caesars declared themselves God. Some took women into their households by force. Some used power without restraint. Under this interpretation of the sons of God are powerful rulers. The daughters of men are ordinary women. The Nephilim become violent warriors and legendary figures. The emphasis falls on human arrogance, human power, human oppression, and human violence. This interpretation highlights an important feature of Genesis 6, though. The problem throughout the chapter is the violence. Genesis 6:11 says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was full of violence." It's deeply concerned with the human abuse of power, and this interpretation sees Genesis 6 as another example of humanity grasping the authority that belongs only to God. So the question here is, were they giants? Most people associate the Nephilim with giants. That idea comes largely from the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint. It translated Nephilim as gigantes, hence the tradition of giants. There may be some support for this. As we have said, the second biblical reference occurs in Numbers 13, when God told Moses to send his spies out into the land of Canaan. The spies were brought back in verse 28. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and in the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Anak, also known as the Anakim, or sometimes Nephilim. The language certainly suggests extraordinary size, yet we should remember something important. These were frightened spies, and frightened people can tend to exaggerate. The point of the passage is not necessarily a scientific measurement of height. It is the overwhelming fear experienced by Israel. Even so, Scripture does mention unusually large individuals later. The Anakim, just mentioned, the Rephaim, King Og of Bashan, and of course the giant Philistine warrior Goliath. Whether these figures were actually descendants of the Nephilim remains uncertain. The Bible never explicitly says so. So why does Genesis explain more? Why doesn't Genesis explain more? This is perhaps the most important question. Why? Because the Nephilim are not the main point. We are. The story is not really about mysterious beings. It's about humanity. Notice what happens immediately after the Nephilim are mentioned. Genesis 6 verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And there is the focus on human wickedness and human corruption and human violence. The Nephilim are not the centre of this story. The condition of humanity is. The Bible is not inviting us to become obsessed with giants. It is inviting us to confront the reality of sin. And this is where Genesis becomes deeply relevant to us. Because Genesis 6 is not merely about something that has happened long ago. It is about what happens whenever humanity attempts to live independently from God. Sin never remains isolated. It spreads. Adam sins. Cain murders. Lamech celebrates vengeance. The earth fills with violence. The corruption grows wider and deeper, like a crack in a windscreen, or rot in a foundation, or like cancer in a body. Sin always seeks to expand. Genesis shows how evil becomes systemic, embedded, cultural, and normalized. The world before the flood is not merely a world with sinners. It is a world where sin has become the operating system. A world where violence is ordinary. A world where God's design is being rejected at every level. A world moving back towards chaos. Creation and decreation. One of the great themes of Genesis is the movement from creation to decreation. Genesis 1, God separates waters. In the flood to come, the waters return. In Genesis 1, dry land appears. In the flood story, the land disappears beneath the sea. In Genesis 1, life flourishes. In the flood, life is swept away. The flood is not merely punishment, it's a type of decreation, the undoing of an ordered world. The created order is breaking apart, boundaries are collapsing, and chaos is returning. The world is becoming unrecognizable. Genesis is painting a picture of civilization in terminal decline. The most remarkable verse, that's the most remarkable verse. Among all the mysteries of Genesis 6, perhaps the most astonishing couple of verses are not about the Nephilim at all. It is verses 6 to 7 of Genesis 6. And it says this: "And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them." Some translations say his heart was filled with pain. Let's just pause there for a moment. The God who spoke galaxies into existence, the God who created humanity in love, the God who walked with Adam in the garden, now grieves over what humanity has become. This is a picture of divine sorrow. God is not indifferent to evil, but he is wounded by it. The sense that these verses carry is that God sees. He sees that things are bad, really, really bad. The flood story begins not with an angry God looking for an excuse to judge. It begins with a grieving God looking at a broken world. A world that he made, and he is going to rectify the situation. He is going to take responsibility, and in doing so, brings things back into line. Yes, his judgment is wiping out the majority of mankind, and yet judgment is never God's final word, because immediately after describing humanity's corruption by the contagion that is sin, we have the final verse in this section, Genesis 6:8. "But Noah found favour in the eyes of the Lord." One man, one family, a remnant, one thread of hope. God preserves a future. God preserves his promises. God preserves his plan of redemption. Even in judgment, there is mercy. Even in destruction, there is grace. Even in a collapsing world, there is hope. And that hope will ultimately point beyond Noah, beyond an ark, beyond the flood, towards Jesus Christ, the truly righteous one, the one who will enter the waters of judgment on behalf of humanity, the one through whom God begins a new creation, the one through whom a fallen world can be made new. And we see this emphasis in Romans chapter 5 verse 12 through to 22. Paul uses the contrast between Adam and Jesus as the second and true Adam to show that the spread of the contagion known as sin came through the first Adam and his descendants. But Jesus will be the final and full solution, who will undo all the sin and death that the first Adam unleashed upon the world. And so, by defeating sin and death, unites us back into a living union with God, as we were created and designed to do for all who choose to believe. So, some final thoughts before we finish. Who were the Nephilim? Well, the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. They may have been fallen angel offspring. They may have been mighty warriors. They may have been tyrannical rulers. Faithful Christians have held different views for centuries, but perhaps the greater lesson is this: Genesis never intended the Nephilim to become the centre of our attention. I see this passage as a warning about what happens when humanity rejects God, a warning about the spread of evil, a warning about the corruption of power, and a warning about a world descending into chaos. Yet it is also a reminder that God never abandons his creation, even in the darkest chapters of Scripture, even when judgment is approaching, even when the world appears to be beyond repair. God is already preparing a rescue. And that is exactly where our next episode takes us. To an ark and to a flood, to judgment and ultimately to salvation, to one of the most dramatic stories in all of Scripture, the story of Noah. The Nephilim remind us that the world was broken. Noah reminds us that God has not given up on it. There's no doubt the Nephilim are one of the Bible's great mysteries, but Genesis isn't ultimately asking us to solve a mystery. It's asking us to face a tragedy. A world created good has become filled with violence. Humanity has chosen its own way, the earth descending back into chaos, and God is about to act. But before the rain falls, before the fountains of the deep burst forth, before the ark rises on the waters, one man finds favour in the eyes of the Lord. And that's where our story goes next. So thank you for tuning into the Simply Christian podcast. My name is Barry, and we hope you've enjoyed listening, and maybe it's challenged you a little bit to think about these things. But look out for episode 9 coming soon. We're calling this Noah, a Flood, and a World Still Unravelling. So tune in next time. But for now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom.